Good afternoon, and welcome to NPC's webinar, Driving Evidence-Based Health Plan Coverage by Recognizing Gaps, Updating Practices. I'll now turn it over to Jennifer Graff.
Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Graff, and I'm the Vice President of Comparative Effectiveness Research at the National Pharmaceutical Council. If you're new to NPC, welcome. We're glad you could join our webinar today. And if you're familiar with NPC, you'll know that NPC focuses on developing high-quality evidence, ensuring that value can be measured and delivered, ensuring appropriate access to treatments in a space that allows for healthcare spending to encourage innovation. So if you say that at a cocktail party, many people will ask, so what is it that you actually do? And that's part of today's focus. So for many of you, if you think about the beginning of the year, employees and consumers have to select health plans. And many times, if you have the choice of several health plans, you might get a message that looks a bit like this. You'll have each of the different plan options, you'll have premiums, you'll have deductibles, you'll be able to figure out if your providers are included in the network and whether or not your medications are also on formulary. Can be a bit overwhelming, and a lot of information to take in, lots of costs. And part of that, there's also a quality indicator. You can see some green stars that help try to provide information for consumers as they're selecting health plans, not just what it will cost for them, but also what's the quality of that benefit. The challenge is it can be overwhelming. And so even if a product is on formulary, you may still need to understand how it's going to be covered. What's your cost sharing? How much will you pay each month with your copay or deductible? Are there limits to what is incorporated? And will you qualify for that medication? Again, additional information that consumers and patients have to dig into. And that only includes the diseases and conditions that the patient may have today. And if you're like most of us, no one anticipates getting sicker or needing new medications throughout the year. So understanding what might be covered, what new treatments, if you need a treatment alternative, and how those decisions are made is very important. So some might assume, well, it's just one size fits all. If it's covered by one plan, it's covered by others. But we know from recent research with Dr. Chambers that only 1 in 6 drugs and coverage plans within specialty medications are covered the same way across plans. It's highly variable what treatments might be covered for which conditions. Now, what drives this? For those of you that are very familiar with health plan coverage, give us a pause because there are some on the line that this may be new. Typically, there's something called a P&T committee, a Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee. And what happens is a plan will decide whether or not to cover a new treatment and who to cover the treatment for. Plan staff, usually clinically trained pharmacists, physicians, nurses, will review the available information. And there can be a lot, and sometimes there can be very little. They'll summarize that information and develop what's called a formulary monograph for P&T. And the P&T, or the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, is often comprised of external physicians and practicing pharmacists, specialists in geriatrics, cardiovascular disease, oncology, etc. And they'll make a decision on whether to cover a medication or not. And there may be a second group that's also called the Value Assessment Committee that may look at the value of the treatment. But the critical piece for today's discussion is what is underlying the coverage decisions. As you see in the blue bar, what's the research that's being used? How is it pulled together? And what do the ultimate recommendations include? Now, this is important not only for these groups, but also for accreditation organizations, and it's pretty standard across many different organizations. So if we think about it, what we've just described is there's an available set of evidence, available studies, clinical studies, studies of real-world evidence, understanding how treatments work in everyday patients and everyday care settings. That's pulled together by clinical staff using scientific judgments. The clinical staff will then make judgments about value, which is more important, avoiding strokes or reducing hospitalizations, making judgments about costs versus outcomes, and is the benefit worth the cost? And all of that comes together into a formulary coverage decision. So while many plans may make different decisions, some may be lower cost providers than others, trying to ensure that healthcare is affordable for all patients. Others may be more of a Cadillac plan. And so their decisions and formulary coverage may vary. But as outlined by one of the experts and fathers of evidence-based medicine, David Eddy, he says that assuming there's some evidence to evaluate, it should be possible for reasonable, open-minded people to agree on the results of this, quote, evidence stuff, far left, as it goes towards formulary coverage policy. So to better understand this, today's webinar is looking at the gaps between the evidence and coverage policies. Is there variation in the quantity, breadth, and type of information used? What are the challenges if we want to close that variation? And what is the current state of formulary development practices? So today I'm joined by our panelist, Dr. James Chambers, who's an investigator at the Center for Evaluation of Value and Risk in Health at the Institute for Clinical Research and Health Policy at Tufts, affectionately known as CEVR. So James, as you'll note, has become an expert on evaluating payer coverage of medical technology and quantifying pharmaceutical innovation in the U.S., despite his expertise that he brings from Ireland. He has a graduate degree from Belfast, as well as master's from the University of York and a PhD from Brunel. And he'll be talking about a study that we did together to better understand what goes into coverage decisions for specialty medications. Now, health plans offer something that customers want to buy. And who is the customer for most health plans? It's employers. And to help understand what employers are looking for, Scott Thompson, who's Area Vice President for Research and Insights, a division of Arthur J. Gallagher, will be joining us to share the employer perspective. Over the past 20 years, Scott has worked with biopharmaceutical companies and other healthcare stakeholders to really understand how employers are looking at business opportunities, developing strategic and tactical plans for providing wellness for their employees, and providing support for performance of account management teams. I've had the chance to work with both Scott and with James, but Scott really brings a very practical, forward-looking approach to understand what the market needs and wants, and trying to identify how we're going to put into practice key elements to develop wellness programs. One of his key insights was looking at the impact of obesity on worker productivity in the employer environment. So he'll be offering up key segments of what employers are looking for and what are those levers to better understand. And so with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Chambers.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks for everybody for taking the time to join us on today's webinar. And the study that I'm going to present today was funded by the National Pharmaceutical Council as well. So thank you very much for your support of this particular research agenda. Okay, so why I was motivated to perform the study I will discuss today, well, there was a number of reasons for it. And I think the major reason was variation in commercial health plan decision making. And Jen's already summarized some of that variation in her opening slides. Now, what this figure shows is this variation. And on the x-axis, we have 17 health plans. I haven't named the health plans, but these are 17 of the largest commercial health plans in the US. It's important to note here that we focus only on the commercial line of business, not Medicare and Medicaid, though hopefully we would do in the future. But this is just looking at 17 of the largest commercial health plans in the US for the commercial line of business. Now, what's represented here are these health plans' coverage decisions, in this case for orphan drugs, so a set of specialty drugs which we study here at Tufts. And if we look at Health Plan 1 on the left, you can see there that 35% of the time, Health Plan 1 is covering these products for the same patient population as the FDA approved the product. So this is the blue part of the bar. This means that the health plan covered the drug but did not apply any coverage restrictions such as patient subgroup restrictions or step edits as part of that decision. The yellow part of the bar is when the health plan covered the drug but did so only after applying restrictions such as patient subgroup restrictions or step edits. And only 1% of the time, there are 2% of the time, Health Plan 1 did not cover the product. Now, if you look across these health plans, you can see wide variation in how these health plans are behaving. Some health plans are much more restrictive in how they cover these orphan drugs than other health plans are. Now, this variation is very motivating for this study. Why do we have this variation across health plans? Why this variation in patient access to the same products across different commercial health plans? Okay, well, I think in many ways this variation is expected. I mean, unlike Ireland and the UK and many other countries, we don't have a single payer here. We have lots of independent decision makers all making their own decisions of how to cover these products. So some variation is expected, and I think there's some very good reasons for that. For instance, I think it's definitely the case that these commercial health plans are tailoring their coverage policies to the specific patient populations. So while one health plan in Florida may cover a product in one way, there's no guarantee that a health plan in California would do the same thing. So this tailoring to the specific populations, I think, is expected and something that we would certainly want. As Jen mentioned in the introductory slides, there's also variation, I think, or differences in the financial resources available to different plans. We have low-cost plans and maybe more Cadillac plans, and what they would offer would also differ. Third, of course, contracting plays a large role here, and rebates and value-based contracting. And different approaches to contracting would also lead to differences in how these specialty products would be covered. But number 4 here is what we want to talk about today, as this inconsistency in the evidence that these health plans use. It could be that what's driving these decisions is that these health plans are basing their decisions on a different body of evidence. And that's what we're going to examine very specifically today as part of this study. Okay. The overarching question that we ask is high quality evidence being used for decision making? Now, at the top of the slide here, you can see 17 health plans, commercial health plans. These are the 17 health plans that we included in this study. So we examined these 17 health plans decisions for 207 different drugs. We considered each drug separately for its different indications. So if a drug is indicated for 2 different indications, we would consider each of those drug indication pairs separately. And this was across 167 conditions. And because these are specialty products, those conditions, as you would imagine, would be those that we typically manage with specialty pharma. Things like rare diseases, oncology, autoimmune disorders, and so on. So overall, in the data set at the time of the analysis, we had 5,000 coverage decisions. So what this means is 5,000 instances of a health plan issuing a coverage decision for a drug for specific indication. On the left of the figure, on the bottom left of the figure, we have a little screenshot here of Anthem's coverage guideline. So you yourselves could access this. This is information provided by Anthem on how they make these coverage decisions. And a key aspect of how Anthem and all of these payers tell us that they make these coverage decisions is a detailed review of the available clinical literature, among other things. So other things like guidelines, expert clinical opinion, and so on. So how they make decisions is built, I strongly believe, on a foundation of the evidence, or at least it should be. Now in the bottom right here, we have a little snapshot from a coverage policy. I'm going to show this in a little bit more detail on an upcoming slide, but what this shows is a set of citations that health plans have included, or one health plan has included in their coverage in a particular coverage policy. So what we're doing in this study is examining this evidence base, the evidence base that these health plans include in those publicly available coverage policies. So the data source for this analysis was the Specialty Drug Evidence and Coverage Database, which is a database that I manage with my team here at CEVR. And the goal of this database is trying to quantify or better understand what's driving decision-making in the US. Is the variation in decision-making? What factors influence how a particular drug is covered by these commercial payers? And the sponsors of our center, which is CEVR at Tufts, have access to this data and they can dig around the data themselves. Now, in this database, which continues to grow over time, At the time of this analysis, as I mentioned, we had just over 200 specialty drugs. We had 150 diseases represented here, and 100 different pharma companies manufacture these different products. We had almost 5,000 coverage decisions, and importantly, we had 27,000 citations. So just to really capture what we're doing here, so we go to these health plans' websites, we identify the publicly available coverage policies, we download that policy, and then we carefully review the evidence base that each health plan reviews. If you go to the next slide, you can see an example of a coverage policy. So this is a typical coverage policy that we would include in the data set and what this analysis is based on today. So this is a payer's policy for nusinersen or Spinraza, which, as you all know, is approved for SMA. So what's presented in this slide is the medically necessary language, so patients that meet that medical necessity criteria, and how that health plan is covering this product. So some of the details of the criteria patients have to meet in order to gain coverage or for that health plan to cover the product. Go to the next slide, you can see from that same coverage policy a set of references or citations that the health plan has told us that they base this coverage decision on. So this is a set of references cited in that same coverage document which they communicated how they cover, in this case, Spinraza for SMA. So we have a team of researchers here look at each of these references and categorize the reference with respect to the study type. So in other words, was it a randomized controlled trial? Was it a clinical guideline? Was it a health technology assessment? And so on. And we also confirm whether the study actually included the drug of interest, in this case Spinraza, for its indication, in this case SMA. So what we're doing here is trying to tie the evidence that health plans use to make decisions with the decisions themselves. So we did this 27,000 times for this study. So we looked at 27,000 different citations from these coverage policies in order to perform this analysis. These are three questions I'm going to talk about today. So the first question is, what evidence do payers cite in the coverage policies? So at the very highest level, what types of studies or what types of inputs do health plans cite whenever they're making these decisions? Importantly then, does this vary by health plan? So are different health plans citing different studies whenever making those decisions? And importantly, are they citing a different volume of evidence? So what we're trying to capture here is how much evidence health plans review when making these decisions, and also importantly, what types of evidence do they review in making these decisions? And the third one here, I think, is the most important question, which is how consistent is the evidence that plans cite in their policies? So for the same decision, are health plans citing that same evidence? So let's look at that question first here. Okay, so straight into the data. So the takeaway here of this one is that there's little consistency in the evidence cited by commercial health plans. Now, for this particular assessment, we focused only on clinical and economic evidence. The reason we did that was to make sure we could tie very specifically the study to the coverage decision. So in other words, if we're looking at a randomized controlled trial for, say, infliximab for rheumatoid arthritis, what we're doing here is trying to figure out, do health plans cite that randomized controlled trial in their coverage decisions for infliximab for rheumatoid arthritis? And we look at different study types. So we've got economic evaluations here, so these would be cost effectiveness analyses predominantly. We have evidence syntheses, which are systematic reviews and meta-analyses. We have real-world evidence studies, which are studies that are performed in a real-world setting. An example of that may be a case series study or study based on medical records or a claims analysis. We have other clinical studies, which are studies that are not RCTs or real-world evidence studies. That could be something like a single-arm clinical trial. So it's a study not performed in a real-world setting, but neither is it a randomized controlled trial. And finally here we have randomized controlled trials. So we're just over 1,000 of those. So overall, in this sample, we have 2,700 unique studies. Okay, so unique studies, meaning that the same different payers could cite the same study in their coverage decisions, and that's the yellow bar. Okay, so on average, a study, so any study, so we pull together all of these study types, a study was only cited in 15% of decisions for which that study was relevant. Okay, so on average, all of these studies, a study was cited in only 15% of decisions for which that study was relevant, or said another way, On average, only 15% of health plans in our sample cited the same study for the same decision. And just to repeat my example of that, that would be, I say, a randomized controlled trial for infliximab for rheumatoid arthritis. On average, in this case, you see 18% randomized controlled trials. Only 18% of those RCTs, like infliximab, like that study for infliximab for rheumatoid arthritis, was cited in the right study, meaning, coverage decision, meaning the coverage decision for infliximab for rheumatoid arthritis. So you can see then, overall, 15% of the time that was the case. The study type that was cited most consistently was randomized controlled trials. The study type that was cited least consistently, maybe not surprising to some people in the call, were economic evaluations. So only 8 health plans cited a particular economic evaluation across all of those coverage decisions for which that economic evaluation was relevant. You can see evidence syntheses and other clinical studies were second most consistently cited, but I think the overall percentages were quite disappointing. So we've got less than 18% was the highest that we had here. Now, interestingly, in something that's not represented in this slide, we found that only 38% of these 2,748 studies was cited by more than one plan. So over 60% of these individual studies, these unique studies, were cited only by one plan. So the takeaway from this slide is health plans do not consistently review the same evidence in their coverage decisions. So the next thing that we did was to examine, do health plans cite the same evidence in those coverage decisions? Now, what we're looking at here is the volume of evidence, or the number of studies cited by health plans in their coverage documents. Now, across these health plans, we found 1,500 separate coverage documents, so 1,562 to be precise. So when interpreting this figure, it's important to note that health plans do different things. It's the big challenge, really, for what we're trying to do with this SPEC database. But so some health plans, they would tend to include one drug per coverage policy. So say they would issue a coverage policy for Humira. Other health plans would include all of the drugs indicated for specific indication in the same coverage policy. So they would have, say, a rheumatoid arthritis coverage policy. But nonetheless, that being said, we found huge and very wide variation here in terms of the number of studies health plans were citing in their coverage policy documents. On average, we found 17 or so citations per document, but like I say, that varied, very, very widely, from only 4 or so citations to 64 citations. So the takeaway here is that some health plans cite a much larger body of evidence in the coverage policy than other health plans do. So, but what are those studies? So this looks at the universe of the study types that the researchers here categorize when they're reviewing those studies. So if you look on the right at the key here, we have randomized controlled trials, which are randomized and controlled clinical studies. We have clinical guidelines issued by national clinical bodies, for instance. We have other types of citations. This would be websites or textbooks, FDA labels, health technology assessments, say a technology assessment submitted performed by ICER. Editorials and non-systematic reviews, other clinical studies, real-world evidence, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and economic evaluations. So the largest piece or slice of this pie, so most often, or the type of study with the most citations were randomized controlled trials. Second most often, clinical guidelines. And then as you go down the list there, you can see real-world evidence was 7%, and economic evaluations was only 1%. If you combine that with health technology assessments, you would see a larger body of economic evidence being cited. But in terms of strict cost effectiveness analyses, only 1%. That represented only 1% of the evidence. Now we're going to stratify that across health plans. So to make this slide manageable, and I don't want to give anybody a migraine during the lunch hour, and we've pulled together some of these categories to make 6 different categories. So randomized controlled trials, real-world evidence, FDA label package inserts, economic evaluations, evidence syntheses, HTAs and guidelines, and others which include editorials. So overall, you can see that I think it's 18% or so of the evidence that health plans cite are randomized controlled trials. So it's the blue bar on the far left, the bottom left of the figure. So above that, the sort of purpley color there, you can see that, let me see, what would that be? Roughly 30% on average, of the evidence that health plans cite are evidence syntheses, HTAs, and clinical guidelines. So this synthesis of the evidence. But we see, again, wide variation here across these health plans. So they're clearly basing these decisions on at least reporting different body of evidence in those decisions. For instance, Health Plan 4, 1/3 of the evidence is RCTs. But if you look at Health Plan 6, it's a much smaller percentage. Similarly, Health Plans 3, 8, 10, and 15, nearly half of the evidence they cite are these evidence syntheses, so clinical guidelines, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and so on. Interestingly, for Plan 6, you can see 2/3 fall into this other category, so this non-evidence really category. So the takeaway here is that plans really do vary in terms of the types of evidence that they base their decisions on. It seems to me that some health plans perform their own evidence assessments, while some other plans tend to rely more on guidelines and other types of evidence synthesis, such as systematic reviews and meta-analyses. Okay, so my last few slides here, so just to close. So this is the paper that was published in Health Affairs that summarizes this study I'm talking about today. It was published at the end of last year. And we have three distinct findings. The first is that only 15% of health plan coverage policies for the same drug and the same condition cited the same study. So a study that was relevant to that drug and condition. And we found that only 38% of all studies were cited by more than one plan. So a lack of consistency, to say the least. We found variation in terms of the volume of evidence, meaning that we found that there was a range of between 4 and 64 studies in a particular coverage policy document. So health plans are definitely basing decisions on a different volume of evidence, if nothing else. And third, the types of evidence varied. So it's not just that health plans are looking at more evidence or less evidence, but the types of that evidence also differ, with some plans seemingly have a greater preference for clinical studies or real-world evidence than other plans do. And something I've not presented today is the variation across diseases, but when we look at that level of detail, you can see again differences in how this evidence is distributed. Okay, my next slide then looks at some study limitations. Of course, every study has limitations, and this one has a number that I wanted to highlight as well. First is that it is unclear if health plans cited all the evidence they reviewed. So, as I mentioned at the start of my talk, what we rely on are the publicly available coverage policies. Now, we don't know whether the health plans included in those coverage policies all of the evidence that they reviewed. We also don't know for a study that's not included whether they didn't review it or whether they did review it and didn't consider it to be relevant. Another limitation is that different plans may have different committees that look at different types of evidence. So it could be, for instance, that the coverage committee tend not to look at economic evidence in one plan because when it gets to the value assessment stage, that's when that evidence would play the role. But for other plans, that might not be the case. So you would expect some inconsistency there. Of course, our findings may not be generalizable. Not only we do look at the largest commercial payers, but certainly this wouldn't be relevant to every payer. And certainly, we didn't include Medicare and Medicaid here, so that's important to note. And I think also an important limitation is we did not account for the quality of the cited studies. So we look at the types of the studies, but just because a study cites a randomized controlled trial doesn't mean that it's a high quality randomized controlled trial, for instance. We just looked at that study type. Thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Excellent. And we'd like to move on to the panelist questions, which is really about what is most important to the different stakeholders. So we'll be hearing from Scott shortly about what's most important to employers. The other two questions that we'll be teeing up are, how does the inconsistency in evidence impact decisions for patients, providers, etc.? And then finally, we'll be discussing what incentives would be needed to facilitate greater consistency and transparency. So with that, let me turn it over to Scott to talk about the implications for employers and what's most important.
Hello, everyone. Great to be with you. Thank you, Jennifer. And Dr. Chambers, that's an amazing amount of variation in the use of evidence. And I think it's fair to say, regardless of the stakeholder, I don't think employers would be very happy to know this is the current status of our pursuit of, quote, evidence-based medicine. So thank you for sharing that information. My goal is to present the employer perspective predominantly. There may be a few touch points that I'll make with regard to patient and provider issues, but the research that we're presenting off of is particularly large and jumbo employers. So the first slide that's up here I want to present to you is really looking at what is the perspective of employers with regard to the pharmacy benefit, and specific to specialty medications, which was what this research was about as well. So interestingly enough, as you can see in the top bar, the cost of specialty biologics is a huge issue for employers. And actually, we've repeated this. We've been doing this research since 2005. So the cost issue with specialty RX has been the number one factor impacting, the number one importance, if you will, highly important issue for employers for the past 6 years in a row. There's other issues here, but I just wanted to point out that this is an important topic to employers, but this is specific to the pharmacy benefit. And as you know, with specialty medications, it's estimated that about 50% go through the pharmacy benefit and 50% go through medical. So and if we can look at what is the employer perspective with regard to the medical benefit, you'll see on the slide here that it's quite a different story. I think everybody would admit that the pharmacy benefit is much more advanced in terms of the management status and the use of information and management tools. But as we see on the medical benefit side of things, employers are increasingly interested in managing and having better information to manage the medical benefit. I think it basically says we're just getting started on the medical benefit management side of things. So on the left side, where employers are inactive, as you can see, there's about 14% that are not aware of the health plan approach in the blue bar on the left. If we move over to the green bar, over to the right active side, there's 26% of these employers say they're requiring active management of the medical benefit. And then I should mention the orange bar all the way to the right, the most active, 11% of these large and jumbo employers said this is not applicable because we've already moved the coverage of the prescription drugs from the medical benefit to the pharmacy benefit, where it's theoretically better managed, if you will. This is to give you a perspective of their concerns with the management of biologics. And essentially, you see in the left side of the slide on this sort of descending graph of percentage highly concerned. Once again, cost is the major issue. But what's interesting is cost to employer is number one, but cost to employees. And again, keep in mind, this is from the employer perspective, telling us that cost to employees was their number two issue with regard to these particular medications. And that's interesting because that's the first time that element has ranked second in the chart. It's always been further to the right and further down the list, if you will. Third on the list is site of care pricing issues. As most of you know, infusion or specialty medications, primarily on the medical benefit, if they're delivered in a hospital setting or a doctor's practice that's now owned by a hospital, that can be incredibly expensive for the plan sponsor or the employer. So that's why that's a top issue. But I think it's pretty telling to see that effectiveness is in fourth position at 57%. And it's hard to interpret what that means, but one might think that they believe that the effectiveness is either a given, or they might actually have some concerns about the information and the data that they're receiving and the decisions that are being made. So next slide, let's look at these formulary decisions. This is an interesting perspective from employers. It's predominantly on the prescription side. Obviously, PBMs manage the medical benefit a little bit, as I showed you earlier. But essentially, employers, and the top bar here says, if presented with compelling evidence, they would be willing to act or be willing to make a formulary change with our PBM to cover a specific prescription drug. The second and third bars basically say on the list here that we rely on third-party vendors and our PBM experts to sort of coach and counsel us or provide the analysis and information and data on the decisions that they have made. The fourth bar says we want to better understand, so they're not all that happy with how the formulary decisions are made or the information that's being presented to them. And most telling, especially relevant to the first bar, is the fifth one that we've highlighted in light blue there at the second from the bottom. We have been presented with clinical evidence to support making individual RX decisions and evaluations. And you can see that number is only 26%. There's a little bit of a disconnect in terms of the interest in receiving compelling evidence and how much they're actually receiving to support the decisions that are being made by these third-party vendors that they rely on. Let's go to the last slide, which just reinforces who in the decision-making process or who in the influence of the decision-making process is important. And not surprisingly, benefits advisors, the consultants, particularly pharmacy specialized consultants, which more and more employers are moving to, are very influential in the decision-making process. That's the dark blue bar. And then the lighter blue bar is moderately influential. So you see that in total, while they're not as influential as the benefits advisors, in this case, pharmacy benefit managers come in second place. But this is about pharmacy benefit decisions. Our information says if it was a medical benefit decision, the PBM and the health plan would switch places. And the last point I want to make on this slide, though, is that other employer peers are very important. Employers look side to side to their peers to see what they're doing and how they're handling different situations. So in this particular topic, this variation topic, they would be looking to either their competition or the key opinion leaders in the space and to see what they're doing to handle this particular situation. So what I'd like to do, that's the content of my slides, but I want to provide you with a few conclusions as we step out of this. And one is that I think the data shows that employers are extremely interested in this topic, in specialty medication, better management, better information, and particularly compelling is how the medical benefit decisions are made, which oftentimes is, from the insurance carriers or the health plans that were listed in this particular study. I think more are beginning to ask the questions and requesting both better management and better data, especially on the medical side of the benefit. So the second point I'd like to make, though, is that employers typically don't have clinical teams on their staff. They're really staffed by benefits folks. And so the clinical expertise usually comes from outside their organization, from the pharmacy consultant or the PBM or the health plan vendors, if you will. So there are a few exceptions to that. There's a few employers that have full-blown clinical teams and some that even have a P&T process. But for the most part, they're going to have to rely on their outside experts, if you will. And therefore, when we get to this topic of variation, and I like the comment that Jennifer made earlier, is we have to be practical. Employers themselves will not be the ones to be able to take action and do the reviews or ensure that the variation has been worked out of the system or to improve the quality of the evidence used in the decision-making process here. They're going to have to rely on their third parties, and that could be perhaps there's a quality process called Evaluate by the National Alliance of Healthcare Purchasers, which is really the employer coalition movement. There could be, I think the people who are best positioned to actually include this in the process would be the benefits consultants, specifically the pharmacy advisors doing the RFIs and RFPs. And perhaps if there was some third-party quality organization that was ensuring across, let's just say the study, across these 17 health plans, that there was either a score or perhaps a checkbox that they followed the quality evidentiary review process, and that overall it was shown to remove this variation or improve the use of evidence across these plans, you could see that that could be a checkbox, it could be a scoring system, but it's going to have to come from outside the employers. But I think one of the things that would be interesting would be to see their reaction to this variation, and I think they would be very much in support of a process coming from either a quality organization or from the benefits consultants to drive this variation out of the system. And Jennifer, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Well, this is fantastic. So let's move on to the next slide. And I think you've already touched a little bit about this. How does it impact the coverage decisions? How does it impact employers? So I'm hearing you say that employers are looking for active management, but evidence was not third, fourth, fifth on the list in the issues that they're worried about, but they are very interested in having clinical groups think about this. I want to jump into one of the questions that just came in, which is, should employers or other groups have expertise? You mentioned a third party or a national body, employer benefit groups. So one of the questions asks, should employers contract with pharmacists or others to help control plan costs? Let me just see, Scott, if you have any comments or thoughts there.
Well, what I would say is they do have those resources, but they're predominantly outside the organization. So they utilize the clinical pharmacy team of the National Pharmacy Practice of Aon, Mercer, Willis Towers Watson, or even Gallagher Benefit Services. They have pharmacy practices with those experts that are called in on specific issues and involved in certain very high level or highly important RFIs and RFP processes. Beyond that, and as you go down the food chain, if you will, to the medium and small employers, they may not have that expertise and they may have to rely on the PBM they're using or the health insurance carrier to actually provide that function. And then I will also say some of them actually hire outside medical clinical consultants to sit on their side of the table and keep all the vendors honest as well. So I wouldn't say it's not there. It's just external, and I don't see them actually making that an internal hire decision or an FTE or a headcount. I don't see it going that way for cost containment reasons. Does that answer your question?
Excellent. So James, one of the questions that I have for you is you've also focused on technology assessment and health technology bodies. So can you talk to us a little bit about the focus on transparency and evidence and any lessons that you've had from those other influencers, such as HTA bodies, national coverage decisions, et cetera, and how it might impact other stakeholders?
It's a very, very good question. So it's certainly the case that clinical guideline groups and HTA groups, they have a history of inconsistency in the evidence that they review as well. This isn't a particularly easy job. I think it's worth saying. And something I didn't say during my talk was that health plans do have a complex task here. The evidence changes quite frequently. They have to revisit this decision, and it's quite resource intensive to do so. And while clinical guidelines and HTAs, they would issue that particular guideline and they don't update it for a while, health plans do have to update these things more frequently. So while they could be better, I think these health plans and the thoroughness of the evidence review, I do have some sympathy, and we can point towards the clinical guidelines groups and the HTAs and see some inconsistency there as well. Now, just on the importance of that transparency, I think for stakeholders, transparency is critically important, and I truly believe that these health plans should be more transparent. I mean, for patients and providers, just to even describe to them why are certain restrictions applied to some coverage, to some drugs, but not to other drugs. Why is it that this particular health plan has decided to cover the drug in this way, while another health plan has decided to cover the same drug in a different way? It's really affecting, I think, patients' access to these products, and physicians. It's affecting how physicians prescribe, because they have to tailor the treatment not just to the patient, but also to the patient's insurance company. Even the industry, I think, it complicates matters in terms of how we generate evidence, because unless we really know what evidence is most compelling to health plans and decision makers. And it's very difficult to generate the evidence that's really going to, illustrate the value of a particular product. My very last comment on this would be that there are lessons from elsewhere that we could point to and try to learn from. Even within the US, we have national coverage determinations that are issued by Medicare. They're highly transparent, but they're required to be by statute. And recently, LCDs, or local coverage determinations that are issued by Medicare administrative contractors, must now follow the same very transparent process that NCDs do. So there is a path here, though I think it would be more difficult for private groups and commercial health plans.
Great, very helpful. So you've already mentioned some of the incentives, and I want to transition to this so we can get to the audience Q&A that is coming in very quickly. So James, you mentioned that this is not a unique problem to health plans having greater variation. In fact, a decade ago, the clinical practice guideline groups found that there was little consistency in the evidence that was cited. For instance, this is one from diabetes, showing very little consistency from country to country and guideline group to guideline group. So that doesn't even incorporate the cost and those other contextual factors that might exist. So many of the groups in the clinical practice guideline area have thought about two different factors. National Academy of Medicine had a whole initiative around clinical guidelines we can trust, and I think some of those lessons might be useful here. In the clinical practice guidelines we can trust, they focused really around two things. One, enhancing the processes. So as you see on the left-hand side, what can we do to increase the infrastructure capacity for groups to review the evidence? And if you've ever had the opportunity to try to dig through anywhere from 10 to 500 studies in a PubMed search, it can be quite challenging. And so having those processes are quite important. The second piece that we've often heard from several studies is it's not just about generating more evidence, it's about generating better evidence. So do health plans, is the evidence fit for purpose? Do they trust the results? And so we can think about these in two dimensions on the y-axis, something that's informal or more voluntary, as well as things that are more formal and structured. And so as you think about voluntary, they're usually trainings and certificates. And they're the formal and structured program. It'd be much more similar to what James just mentioned around the local coverage decisions and requiring greater transparency. So as we think about this, one of the things that could be done, if we think about this, is identifying who needs to know the question. And the closer that we better align with stakeholders to understand what is a C-suite or a financial group or a clinical group within a health plan, what do they each want to know? Because what the financial team may need to know or the value assessment committee may need to know may be a very different outcome than what the clinical pharmacist is asking. And so making sure you prioritize what research is conducted is one of the first steps. The second step could be, if you've read one study, and many times they may be reported or different information may be in different places. We often hear that having a more complete reporting or more of a core template to help plans find the information about who were the patients that were involved in the study. Do they look like my members? A health plan in Southern California might look very different than a health plan membership population in the Northeast. And so trying to ensure that we do a better job, industry and others, of developing evidence and providing it in a consistent template is one alternative. As we think about the processes, over the past 20 years, we've seen digital health records. You can access your data online. You can see electronic health records. And so there's a whole variety of evidence, just as James had presented, around the increase in real-world evidence. And those assessment and appraisal skills are much different than assessing randomized controlled trials. So understanding not only who's involved, but what's involved, and does the staff at the health plan or even on the P&T have those processes is one of the opportunities. Another opportunity Similar to every P&T being required to have a statistician or a gerontologist on the committee, perhaps there's an opportunity to make sure that at least one of the P&T committee members has expertise in real-world data or has someone with specific training. So there's many ways that we can think about how we could try to resolve this consistency issue. And it's not just things that we've been thinking about. As formulary development has gotten more complex because we have precision medicine, we have much narrower and ultra-orphan populations that are being treated, the types of data are changing as well as the payment mechanisms. We've seen some evolution over the past 20 years on how to develop formulary systems, starting back in 2000, 2008, to more recently from AMCP in 2020. And so some of the things that we've talked about recently came out in a report in January that NPC was also a sponsor and participant in. And really these two core elements that we want to focus on. One is making sure that the principles and best practices for evidence are used. And so thinking about randomized clinical trials are an important part of the formulary development process, but the partnership forum, which included 24 health plan and other representatives, recommended that real-world data can provide additional context and formulary updates. We also mentioned cost-effectiveness research can help with the value of a therapy and incorporating patient perspectives. So there's best practices that professional bodies are starting to put out. The second element that AMCP focused on was around training and education and making sure that the methods and data can be available for not only the health plan clinical representatives, but also the external P&T committee members. So understanding how to interpret the clinical data, how to interpret value and cost benefit, and how to present this in a fair and accessible manner is one of the other approaches that we can be thinking about. So I think one of the elements that's coming up, and we see it a little bit in the training program is, or in the AMCP program, is how do we think about some of these elements? And I guess one of the questions I want to turn over to James, were you surprised, and this came in from the audience, were you surprised by the low level of economic analyses that were cited by many of the plans? And if so, what should be done about that?
Well, that's a very good question. As a health economist, I was very disappointed by that. Now, I should say as well, looking at that pie chart that I think the questioner is referring to, that is only cost effectiveness analyses in that 1%. So we do have health technology assessments in there that include, many of which would include that cost sort of effectiveness or economic component. And we do see actually that some health plans look quite far afield for this information. So one health plan actually would cite technology assessments that are performed in England, in Canada, Australia, and so on. They even cite one from Ireland, which struck me as surprising, but there you go, they did. And so it does seem to me as if there is an appetite here for that information. It's maybe not fully represented in this slide. I think one comment I had during my slides was there are different groups within these health plans that are making these decisions. So it may be that what I'm looking at here, at least for some plans, is the group that's looking at the coverage decision, and they tend to focus on the clinical evidence. But while the economic evidence is being considered, it's by a different group, which may be the group that's negotiating the rebate or the value assessment group. In terms of what can we do about it, well, I think greater discussion and so greater awareness about the value of economic evaluation and how it can improve decision making is something that we should be, pushing as academics here, I guess, to try to better improve the field and and how frequently that evidence is being used.
James, there was also a question about the high variation in real-world evidence. Do you have any hypotheses on why there was such variation across the health plans?
Again, that's a very good question. So we just have a paper actually that's under review that's focusing just on real-world evidence. So hopefully that'll be published quite soon. For me, I think the reason for it is simply that some health plans find real-world evidence more compelling than other health plans. We saw there in terms of the volume of evidence that some health plans are citing very little evidence, and those health plans, when they only cite maybe 6 or 7 studies for coverage decision, they wouldn't tend to focus on the real world evidence. It's mainly those health plans that are citing much more evidence that spread the net further, and they would review that real world evidence. I think there's a lot we can do to better inform decision makers about the value of real world evidence. And one study we've looked at, and again, it's the study that's under review, is looking across diseases to see for which diseases health plans tend to look at real-world evidence. We also look over time to see how long the product's been in the market and at what point does that real-world evidence become available and health plans begin to use that evidence. But I think, in summary, it's greater education, it's greater advancement in the methods of real-world evidence. And once that real-world evidence becomes truly valuable to payers and that's adequately communicated to them, I think we'd see greater consistency in its use.
Great. I think we have time for one last question, and I'm going to turn this one over to Scott. So one of the questions came in around the challenges that for someone working in a health system who is making a recommendation and discharging a patient on one treatment, and then a health plan coverage may cover a different treatment. Is this on employers' radar, and are there any recommendations that you have to try to address the inconsistencies in coverage decisions between the health systems and health plans?
Wow. That's an interesting one, and I would say my gut reaction is that it's probably not on the radar screen. I know there's a lot of continuity of care issues that go on in the between the health system and the health plan. I would suggest that perhaps presenting some presentations or experiential evidence, maybe even documenting these situations and the frequency that they occur, I would say have to be inserted into the conversation with employers, whether that would be at their national associations or their regional groups. But I would say this may be just a tad too far downstream for them to have a clear line of sight, and that's probably why there's a challenge there. Sorry, I couldn't be more helpful, but I think that's where we stand.
So for the researchers on the call, you've just suggested a research project for them, so that's fabulous. So the key takeaways that I have from today are that plans have only cited the same study in about 15% of the coverage decisions, and there's probably many reasons for that, both the processes, the quality of the evidence, and perhaps even the contextual factors. However, transparency is really important to better understand what evidence is being used to formulate the coverage. The second takeaway that I had is that evidence is a key part of coverage decisions, but we can't go beyond that. It's not the only component that is in the top of mind with health plans and with employer sponsors. And the third takeaway that I have is that incentives and infrastructure, that no one group is going to be able to do that. We need better training, we need better capacity, we need potentially better evidence to encourage greater transparency. And if we aren't thinking about it, then it's hard for patients who are trying to better make health plan decisions and for employers to assess the quality of coverage decisions. If we can't do this across all the stakeholder components, it's going to be even harder for patients and employers to sort through the myriad of costs and quality information as they're making their own plan decisions. So with that, I'd really like to thank our panelists and presenter, Scott and James, and thank you to the audience for your participation. We'll be sending out a link to the slides as well as the paper via email to everyone registered for the webinar, and we'll archive the webinar on the npcnow.org website in the coming weeks. Thank you again for your time and your participation. Have a marvelous afternoon.